In 2022, something happened in China that hadn't happened for a very long time.
For the first time in more than 60 years, China's population has fallen.
Now, it wasn't exactly a huge decline or anything. In fact, the population fell by only about 850,000 people, which is basically nothing for a country with 1.4 billion people. And to help you understand just how small that decline was, in percentage terms, the drop was only 0.06% of China's population. But it's not the number that matters here, it's what that decline signifies, and more importantly, what it could kickstart.
Many say this is a population time bomb, that it is ushering in a period of decline, and this is likely to be a trend, and these numbers dropping are likely to continue.
So essentially, this decline in China's population for the first time in 60 years will not be its last. As most data predictions show, this drop will mark the start of a long period of continued decline in China's population over the next 70 years. So here's exactly what that would look like. According to UN population forecast, China's population could decline to as low as 700 million people by 2100. Now, the logical question to ask is why? Why exactly will the world's most populated country, known for its incredible population growth, turn around and gradually lose half of that population? And the answer is a mix of three factors that are quite different, but also very connected. The first is China's birth rate. The second is China's death rate. And the third but most important one is China's infamous one-child policy. So let's start with the birth rate. In 2022, the number of births recorded in China dropped to 9.5 million newborns. Now that's a birth rate of 6.77 births per 1,000 people. And that rate is significant because it's the lowest birth rate on record in all of China's history. So how about death rates? That isn't looking good either. In 2022, the death rate in China was 7.37 deaths per 1,000 people, which was also significant because it was the highest death rate in China since 1974. Now, as you see with those two numbers, the death rate is higher than the birth rate, which basically means more people are dying than are being born in China. And that is a quick and dirty summary of the process of how population decline happens. Not enough people being born to replace those that die. Now, of course, it goes without saying that every year in every country around the world, people will die and people will be born. So it makes sense to wonder at what rate the births need to happen to ensure that the country's population is at the very least being replaced to avoid a decline. And the answer is something called a fertility birth rate of 2.1 births per woman. If every woman in the country has an average of 2.1 children, then enough children will eventually have been born to replace that country's population. Unfortunately for China, the current fertility rate stands at just 1.1 births per woman, far less than the 2.1 births required to replace its population. Again, a pretty obvious logical question here. Why exactly is China's birth rate so low, especially after decades of having an exploding population and birth rate? And the answer is a historically controversial move which China took over 40 years ago with the introduction of the one-child policy, a policy which has now become the single biggest factor driving its massive population decline. To help you understand the devastating impact of the one-child policy, we have to do a quick history lesson of how China has tried to manipulate and control the growth of its population. And this lesson starts in the 1950s. Between 1950 and 1970, China's population grew by nearly 50%. And this was a big problem. Because a fast-growing population usually means that the country's government will have to cater to a lot more people than it is probably prepared for. Now, the economic issue here is also obvious. Again, a large, fast-growing population combined with limited resources more often than not results in bad scenarios. And back then in the 1950s, China's resources were limited because it didn't have the huge, prospering economy that it does today. And so the Chinese government decided it had to try population control measures to slow down the exploding population growth and keep it at a more manageable rate. The first thing it did was create the Later, Longer, Fewer campaign in 1973. The first part of the campaign, Later, was to try to ensure that young Chinese people were marrying later by raising the legal age of marriage for men to 25 and for women to 23. The second part of the campaign, Longer, focused on getting these young couples to space births out longer by encouraging at least a 3-year gap between children. And if none of that worked, then the final part of the campaign, Fewer, limited couples to a maximum of just 2 children. The Later, Longer, Fewer campaign proved somewhat successful because between 1970 and 1980, China's fertility rate dropped from 6.1 births per woman to 2.7 births per woman. So it clearly worked if you look only at the birth rate, but it still wasn't enough. Because as of 1980, China's population had reached 987 million, up from 550 million in 1950. And so the government decided it had to do something else and go one step further. And that is where the one-child policy came in. In 1980, China's government rolled out the one-child policy, strictly enforcing most couples in the country to be limited to having just one child. There were a few exceptions, but especially in urban areas, the one-child policy was a well-established restriction on most couples. The logic of the policy was that limiting couples to just one child would allow the government better manage the growth of its population, and there's some evidence to back up that logic. Because between 1991 and 2021, China lifted nearly 800 million of its population out of poverty. And it was only able to do this because there were firm restrictions on how quickly that population was growing. But there's a flip side here as well, because China essentially got more than it bargained for. On one hand, the one-child policy meant that China slowed down the pace of its exploding population growth. But on the other hand, it meant China had slowed it down by far too much. As of 2013, China's birth rate had dropped to 1.7 births per woman, lower than the 2.1 birth rate needed to replace its existing population. And so basically China's population had gone from growing too fast to growing too slowly. In response to this flipped reality, the Chinese government started to slowly roll back the one-child policy in 2013. First by permitting parents who themselves were only children to have a second child if they wanted. But this didn't prove enough. Chinese officials had predicted that easing the one-child policy slightly in 2013 would result in an additional 2 million births in 2014. But in reality, there were less than 500,000 extra births in 2014. And so again, the government decided it had to do something and go one step further, just like it did in 1980, except this time it was in the opposite direction. By the start of 2016, the one-child policy was abolished, with couples permitted to have 2 children. And by 2021, China had gone full circle, from putting a strict one-child policy in place to essentially asking its citizens to pretty much have a lot more children.
For decades now, China's Communist Party has enforced strict birth limits on families. Only one child allowed, no more. Well, now the world's most populous country has pulled a 180. China is actually urging parents to have 3 children to counter an aging population and a shrinking workforce.
But the problem for China is that the new policies encouraging people to have more kids just aren't working. After 35 years of forcing its citizens to have only one child, the culture of having fewer kids has now become deeply set among an entire generation of Chinese people. Having one child is no longer a strict government policy. It has now become a dominant cultural preference. But aside from culture, there are also economic factors at play. For one, the high cost of living in China makes the idea of having a large family impractical, especially given that a vast majority of young people in China cannot afford to buy homes to start a family in. And then there's the dark consequence of China's one-child policy, which saw most couples' preference for having sons result in thousands of abortions of female babies, and also resulting in China having the worst gender imbalance in the world, with millions of men single and unable to start a family because there just aren't enough women in the country. All these factors put together are why pretty much all birth rate predictive models suggest that Chinese people will continue to have children at a rate that's well below the required replacement fertility rate, which will result in consistent population decline over the next 70 years. And so finally, what does this mean for China? The obvious thing is that China's labor force, which is the bedrock of its economy, will shrink. Today, China is the industrial and manufacturing hub of the world because it has a huge population of young people in its labor force. But with fewer children being born, it means that China's population will slowly age and become older, eventually reaching a point where there will be more people outside of its working population than in it. It also means that China could slowly and eventually lose its standing as the global hub for manufacturing, giving a workforce that will shrink, and also eventually lose some of its standing as an international economic and political force. But here's the thing. China is not the only global power that will suffer from a decline in birth rate. Countries like the USA and Germany have similar problems, but they can fix those problems thanks to immigration, with millions of people moving into those countries, building new lives there, and contributing to the economy and the labor force. The bad news for China is that unlike these other countries, China will not be saved by immigration. While the US sees a net positive of around 1 million migrants moving into the country every year, with the majority able to join and boost its labor force, China actually sees a net loss on migration, with more Chinese people leaving the country every year than immigrants moving into it. Now, China's drastic population decline will not happen overnight, but over the next 70 years, as China's population shrinks, it would have gone full circle, from being a country that had a population that was exploding and growing rapidly back in the 1950s, to being a country that's slowly dying and a population that's shrinking bit by bit every single year. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, then please give the video a thumbs up, as that really helps the channel, and don't forget to subscribe as well. And before you go, make sure you check out this playlist of other cool geography videos I've made on the channel. See you in the next one.